Today on BloombergQuint, we're joined by Professor Tarun Khanna from the Harvard Business School. Mr. Khanna, thank you so much for joining us on BloombergQuint.
Happy to be here.
Mr. Khanna, I'd like to start by asking you something that you worked on quite extensively in India, which was the Expert Committee on Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And we saw what Niti Aayog did with that, and we also saw Startup India being announced shortly after that. Do you think it's been successful in terms of implementing that policy?
That whole experience of working with my colleagues at Niti Aayog was very positive. It was the first time I had formally worked with the government. It was a really pleasant surprise to see so many super competent people of all stripes, from civil society, private sector, public sector, all coming together and working on something for the common good. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. So in that sense, it was already a success in many ways. As part of that committee's deliberations, we put out a report that very clearly says that there are some short-run things that we can do, which, if they're implemented, we should be able to see some results in a year or two. Those, I think, are underway. The Atal Innovation Mission, which is something that came out of the report, is ongoing, and I continue to serve as a board member of that mission. But we also said that there are some longer-run structural things that I would say would probably take 5 to 10 years to bear fruit, and then some really long-run things that are generational. And I think it's my role as an academic to call them out and say that everything is not a quick fix.
Right. So it's interesting, over the last few months, we've heard of boardroom struggles, lapses in corporate governance, and the like. Now, when you're viewing this from, your post at Harvard and, so many miles away, do you see these as perhaps power struggles, or just is it a cultural problem? Are these ethical problems? How do you really view these?
Personally connected to every single individual in those things. So I can't be completely unbiased at some level. But stepping back, these are not unique to India, and circumstances arise when there is ambiguity in what the right course of action is, you have to, when you're operating in a boardroom setting, often under high pressure and with high stakes, you have to learn to accommodate different points of view. Every so often, occasionally, it's a very human thing that it spills out into the public, and then I suppose it's the habit of the press to make a lot of noise about it, partly productively and partly, it must be said, less productively. So my view is that I hope it kind of fades away from public attention so that whatever the underlying issues are dealt with but knowing, as I said, every one of those individuals, right, I'm quite confident that they all have the right interests of society and stakeholders at heart. They may have different views on how to address them,
right,
but they will come to the right course of action.
So it's different because what we see in Silicon Valley and in the West is often you see founders come up with these fantastic companies, tech companies, and then these, they put up these empires, and when they let go, they actually let go.
Yeah.
It's very different perhaps in Europe, it's very different perhaps in India, whereas it's perceived really as not letting go of power. And is that very unbecoming according to you?
I would resist the characterization that this is somehow more of a Indian or a developing country trait.
Okay.
Even in my own backyard, you see plenty of instances. In fact, plenty of instances of not letting go,
absolutely,
or of letting go too early, for that matter, and so on and so forth. In fact, one of my colleagues at HBS wrote an entire book on this, basically entirely based on domestic U.S. cases,
right,
talking about, sometimes it might be the best thing to leave as a founder and let a different set of people grow the enterprise. On other occasions, you may make the decision that you're better off running it yourself and trade off scale and impact for your personal objective function. So I have no idea what is transpiring in these particular instances, but I would certainly not accept the characterization that this is anything but. I would say this is a very universal thing. It's a human impulse.
Fair enough, sir. Also, when you talk about what's happening around the world, we see what's happening with BREXIT, with the US elections, the way we were viewing them out here at least, it just seems like the narrative has changed. And from this era of globalization, we're talking about some sort of a reversal, and it seems like nationalistic movements, are coming into play. We're seeing some sort of protectionism as well.
Sure.
With this, especially in India, we view a lot of the news developments from there with a little bit of concern, say H-1B visas, clamping down on them, or green cards. Do you think these are valid causes for concern, or is this something that will just fade away?
So first of all, hindsight is 2020, so we can now come up with rationalizations for what's happened or what's happening, etc. And I would confess to being super surprised, just like every other person, both at Brexit and at Mr. Trump's unlikely rise. I'd also confess that I'm not a fan of either Brexit or of the policies taken by this administration. But that said, there are two observations that I'd like to make that I think are germane to your audience, perhaps. One is that some of us have been talking about using entrepreneurship, which is sort of my area of interest and study, entrepreneurship in emerging markets, but using entrepreneurship as a means to effect social and economic inclusion. And a statistic that I'm often fond of saying is that at least 5 out of 7 billion people in the world are completely locked out of things that you and I might take for granted, or that your audience might take for granted. Well, those 5 billion people, because of these mobile phones that we're holding in our hands, are perfectly aware of what the 2 billion people have, and they're pretty ticked off. So sooner or later, something's going to happen. In fact, I've been teaching at Harvard a course called Contemporary Developing Countries, Entrepreneurial Solutions to Problems of Inclusion for the last 6 years. So in a sense, as in an academic sense, I would not be remiss in saying that I saw something coming, not quite this extreme or this rapid, but it's certainly not something that's inexplicable by any means. And really, in the case of Mr. Trump, there is a sizable fraction of the US population that voted for him. So I think the rest of us have to come to grips with that reality and figure out what's a way to engage productively with these different segments. Second thing I'll say is that half of me is an academic, which is really my passion, and half of me has become an entrepreneur. And as an entrepreneur, I just say, well, let's look at the cards we've been dealt, and let's make something with these cards. There's no point worrying about things that have passed. So sure, maybe H-1B visas, the allocation will change, or the minimum salary will change. Will change the economics. But I think it will also release pent-up resources that we can use in productive fashion in other places. And in India, we're sitting in a smorgasbord of opportunity, just a panoply of interesting things to do. So there's no shortage of fabulous things to do here.
So it's interesting, you mentioned how you don several hats as an academic and an entrepreneur as well. What was that shift like, and what really spurred you to do that?
Hard to say. I'm by nature impatient, and I'm by nature very optimistic. So having done the pure academic thing for 15 years or so, I suppose I must have been restless, and I tried to begin doing things with some of my students. And did a small project that became a company that's quite successful, and realized that it was every bit as challenging as proving a theorem in mathematics, or as teaching a class to an aggressive bunch of CEOs. And by nature, people who are, I guess, achievement oriented or type A personalities, we're often called, seek out challenges. So this seemed like a challenge. And since then, I've just enjoyed it more and more. And what I do, because I only work on problems of economic and social development, and I try to create individual entrepreneur-centric solutions to them. The sort of thing where you say, let's stop complaining about the government or complaining about corruption or the bureaucracy. The question is, what can you do about it? So put up or shut up, and let's get on with it. And most of the time we fail, because these problems, as my course title at Harvard says, solutions to intractable problems. Well, they are intractable, so they're really very hard to solve. But every so often, there's an unlikely constellation of people with different skill sets. And I'm really, really lucky, because I'm sitting in one of the centers of excellence in the world in Boston, where you've got, of course, Harvard and MIT, but dozens and dozens of other institutions and people coming from all over the world. So we kind of mix it up, and every so often, the stars align and we start something, and most of the time it fails, and every so often again it takes off, and then it's really a blast.
And that's the beauty of it.
That's the beauty of it. So.
Absolutely. But Mr. Khanna, also something else I wanted to ask you as well was, you spoke about perhaps businesses and entrepreneurship leading to social and economic development.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, while these aren't entirely alien to India, do you think it's more imperative to really talk about these things in India?
100%. So I believe it quite passionately, which is why I got involved with that Niti Aayog PMO-led exercise on creating some sort of framework to with a lot of colleagues, it must be said. Look, I think the state capacity in developing countries, by which I mean the ability of the state and the government to deliver what we call public goods, is pretty limited. India has been a fascinating success story in many ways in the last almost 70 years now this year, and something that I'm so proud of as still an Indian passport holder and a die-hard Indian, I guess, to my I'm very proud of it. But I also recognize that we're very much a work in progress as a society. And I don't think it's okay for each of us who has plenty, if you will, to just point fingers. I just don't think it's cool, I don't think it's right, I don't think it's ethical. And so I prefer to roll up my sleeves and by the same token, I think one of the things that makes it fun is if you start from a position of some humility and say, this is what I'm good at, whatever it is, and the rest of it, I'm terrible at. And my kids would tell you that I'm terrible at most things. So then you can find other people who can complement you, and that's the role that my ex-students play, and then I get to hang out with them, and they're younger, so they're more fun. So.
This is in one of your papers you've spoken about contextual intelligence.
Yes.
And I found that very interesting because in this post-Brexit, post-Trump scenario, seeing what's happening in India, post-demonetization, I don't know if there's a word we could actually coin for all of these scenarios happening around. There's a lot of uncertainty around.
Post.
Absolutely, sir. So that's the coin word for today. But if we're looking at this scenario and we talk about your theory,
yes.
Are there any corollaries now to that theory? Are we looking at some sort of modification to, and you could also explain, of course, what your theory is.
Yeah, so you referred to a paper that I wrote as a thought collection exercise in the Harvard Business Review in 2014 called Contextual Intelligence. And what I was trying to say is I'm often either studying investors and entrepreneurs who are taking successful ideas from one place and transplanting them somewhere else, or sitting on boards that are engaged in those exercises or investing overseas and things of that nature. In all those cases, there is a human presumption to, in my view, I can't say I've shown this formally, but there seems to me to be a presumption that what succeeded in our past lives is likely to transfer over. So the example that I often use is very prosaic. If you think about something as simple and relatively unchanging as cement, right? Technology to make cement, clinker and limestone and this and that has really not changed in 100 years. Right. And you say, okay, you were really good at running a cement plant in location X. Right. Do you think that you're likely to be very successful in a different country? And most people assume, yeah, it's cement. I ran a cement plant. But it turns out that the technology may be the same of running a cement plant, but that technology is embedded in a whole host of other things. In one country you might buy cement, a handful at a time, or a cement bag at a time. In the other cases, it's all institutional sales. So the sales process is completely different. You might pay for cement very differently. In one place you might have a lot of adulteration of building materials with water mixed in. You might have collapsing buildings, different liability laws. Pretty much everything about it, other than the raw technology, is different. So the idea that you can take running a cement plant here, even though it's so basic a business, to another place is just wrong, it turns out. Not that they're not individuals who pull it off or companies who pull it off, but as an average statistical statement, we tend to overestimate our ability to take things from one place to another because we underestimate the degree to which we must exhibit contextual intelligence, intelligence about the context, and the degree to which we must start, and this is the point that I'd like to emphasize, start from a position of humility. Not because of some saintly attribute, but because that's how you do well and make money. So contextual intelligence actually helps you make money. And if anything, I would say in this post-Brexit, post-Trump world, post-post world, differences between borders are likely to be more exacerbated.
Absolutely.
So I think at a minimum, people who haven't looked at the article should look at it.
Interesting. You've also been a very strong proponent of encouraging liberal arts, especially in a country like India.
Yes, yeah.
Perhaps it broadens one's horizons. You get rid of that blinder approach. Do you think in today's scenario, where perhaps India has the world's largest youth population, and for many years to come, it's high time we actually do that, especially when you're talking about innovation and technology companies, isn't that something that all of us should be focusing on?
Look, I'm a passionate believer in liberal arts, partly because I went to a liberal arts institution for my degree in engineering, applied math, computer science and stuff like that, but it was embedded in a humanities program, so we had to read a lot of literature, we had to study languages, listen to music, watch, look at paintings.
Right.
And I think it really, it sort of gives you a wide angle aperture on society as opposed to something incredibly focused and excellent. So I view myself as very lucky as having stumbled onto that coming from India, moving to the US from Bangalore to Princeton at the time. And it's an ongoing tragedy that it's hard to communicate the value of that to, particularly in developing countries. I mean, the humanities are always under assault, even in America.
Right.
But in developing countries, they don't even exist in any critical mass sense. So it's very nice to see some of my friends, Ashish Dhawan and Pramad Sinha and all these guys who are doing Ashoka University.
Right.
Another one of my students, Kapil Vishwanathan, is starting a liberal arts university in Chennai.
Right.
There's a set of efforts in Pakistan that have reached out to us for advice and help on this issue.
Right.
So I think the more we have of people learning to see the world through multiple lenses, which is the key, which is what the humanities and liberal arts lets you do, and seeing the world the way other people see it, I think not only is it helpful to the people that are at this conference, the NASCOM type engineers who, and this is the topic of what I'll speak about, that even to do something simple with technology, you have to understand the context, which brings us back to contextual intelligence.
Absolutely.
You develop contextual intelligence by developing a wide aperture lens in society, which you get by exposure to different bodies of thought and different kinds of people, which is the point of liberal arts. So how's that? Tied it all together.
It makes sense, but also that something like that would require a massive mindset change, especially in a developing country like India, because everyone's so focused on vocational training that perhaps liberal arts is really sidelined in one's mind space.
But I think in countries like India and China, I spent a lot of time in China also, same thing applies there. The scale of problems is so large that it's, I really believe this, it's a real mistake to say it's going to take a huge mindset change. It's true, but it's not productive to keep harping on it. So I think the better course of action is to, find a small little space where you can experiment with something and then go to some great media guys and say, look, it worked. And the media will tell the story. And I found that things, snowball and cascade pretty fast when something's actually working. That's something that the Chinese, as a policy matter, have been really good at, taking individual things that work and then using Beijing to spread the message. We haven't learned to do that, but maybe my colleagues at NITI and the central government and Arvind and other people will do a better job of that in the future.
Mr. Khanna, thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to talk to you.